This last section is about seed transfer or assisted migration. Thinking, and this can relate to artificial regeneration. These types of discussions are often had within the context of, for instance, reforesting in commercial forests especially, but maybe in other forests. But they may become more important as we really consider the effects of climate change and whether particular genetic types, for instance, are adapted to a particular location. So while these issues have been important for a long time, especially in commercial forestry, they're becoming more and more important as we consider forest management in the context of climate change. Thinking most broadly, when we think about, okay, here's a location that needs to be reforested, the most conservative decision that you can make with regard to what seed to plant there is to plant local seed. So to allow the site to naturally regenerate from trees on site, or to procure seed from relatively nearby, so from a local provenance. That's the most conservative decision, at least not considering changing climate. Seed transfer or assisted migration, so seed transfer just means planting seed outside of its provenance. Okay, so for instance, taking seed that naturally derives from here, this is the Lobbo Pine range, and planting it here would be seed transfer. Taking that seed and transferring it here would also be seed transfer. So seed transfer counts, whether it's within the natural range of that species or transferring it outside the natural range of that species. And there's a number of reasons why seed transfer or assisted migration might be beneficial. So reasons why this might be a good thing to do. One is that non-local seed sources may have more desirable traits. So for instance, growth rate, disease resistance are examples of situations where, especially in commercial situations, where this might be the case. There also are situations where local seed is not available. Say a very large area in a particular region needs to be reforested due to hurricane disturbance or wildfire disturbance, and there just isn't enough local provenance seed available. In that case, it may be more desirable to transfer seed in rather than wait a couple of years to generate sufficient local seed to meet that need. And then certainly, like I said, a growing concern is assisted migration due to climate change. As climate changes, seed that is adapted to a particular location, genotypes that are adapted to a particular location, may not be adapted to that location in the future because weather conditions and climate are changing more rapidly than they have in the past. And it may be that seed cannot migrate naturally fast enough in terms of natural seed dispersal to keep up with those changes in conditions. And in those situations, it may be desirable to artificially move seed basically to keep up with climate change. And that's usually in that context. That's a seed transfer. But in the climate change context, that's usually referred to as assisted migration because we're assisting the movement of that seed because it may not happen reliably naturally due to seed dispersal. So those are some of the benefits. What are some of the risks? Really, the general risk is that seed or genetics may be maladapted to the location where it's planted. That's really the proximal problem with all seed transfer. And, maybe, too wet, too dry, too cold, etc. An additional problem with trees is that trees are long-lived. And it may be that you transfer seed, plant seedlings, and they're fine for a decade. They're growing well. They appear to be well adapted to that new location outside their native provenance. But then a decade scale drought happens that they are maladapted to, and that kills all those trees. That's a problem with long-lived species like trees, is that severe and extreme situations don't happen every year. They tend to happen, over longer time spans. And with an annual crop, that may not be an issue, but with trees, they're likely to exist when the next extreme event happens. So being prepared or taking that into account is a special problem for long-lived forest trees. In order to deal with some of these issues and to make it easier to move seed around, especially commercially, people have developed seed transfer guidelines. And these are seed transfer guidelines for Lobbo Pine. And the way these work, the way this guideline is set up, is that you can move seed around between the dotted lines. So for instance, you could take seed from here and move it here and be relatively comfortable that that's a low risk move. On the other hand, if you take this seed and move it across a dotted line, that's riskier. And you could have a failure due to maladaptation. These dotted lines are minimum winter temperature isotherms. So for Lobbo Pine, a big danger is minimum temperatures in the winter and whether a particular genetic stock is adapted to those colder temperatures in the winter. So those minimum winter temperature isotherms are really important for Lobbo Pine. Without those, it would be very tempting to move seed further north because the more southern seed sources have a longer, are adapted to longer growing seasons, and they would grow longer into the fall than the more northern seed sources. So it can be tempting to get additional growth by moving seed north. But they might be harmed in the winter is what these minimum winter temperature isotherms protect against. The other issue is these solid lines here. The guidelines for most conservative seed transfer are to not transfer seed across those dark lines. And those make sense when you think about the loblolly pine ecotypes that we talked about. So transferring seed from the coast all the way into, for instance, Louisiana and Texas, that's enough of a different environment that there's some greater risk associated with that. So these kinds of guidelines help to sort of facilitate movement of seed without doing a lot of due diligence. Now, looking at, for instance, seed transfer guidelines for Douglas fir. This is Douglas fir in the interior of British Columbia. And so each of these zones here is a seed transfer zone for Douglas fir. So you can safely move Douglas fir within that zone. So you can see this is a lot more complicated than the seed transfer guidelines for loblolly pine. And that's because interior British Columbia is a lot more climatically complicated than the coastal plain and Piedmont of the United States. There are mountains and a lot more latitudinal range in the Douglas fir range than there are in loblolly pine. So these seed transfer zones for Douglas fir are more complicated. So that being said, given the seed transfer guidelines for loblolly pine, for instance, here's some examples of those rules being broken. So for instance, number one, this arrow here shows the transfer of coastal loblolly pine to drier sites in Arkansas and Oklahoma. So fast-growing Atlantic coast loblolly transferred to the interior. That's going across a couple of those dark black lines. And it was quite successful. And I'll talk in a minute about what had to be done to make sure that was a lower risk maneuver. This is an example of transfer of slash pine outside of its range. This loblolly transfer was within the range of loblolly. It was just a provenance transfer, but this is a transfer completely out of the range of slash pine to wet sites in Louisiana, because slash pine is adapted to wet sites. And then another example here is transfer of Livingston Parish loblolly pine from Livingston Parish, Louisiana, to really high rust hazard sites, fusiform rust hazard sites in southern Georgia. Those occurred back in the day before we had bred rust-resistant loblolly pine, and it was very difficult to establish loblolly pine in these high rust hazard sites. So these are all examples of where those seed transfer guidelines were broken for one reason or another. Let's look at the example of that seed transfer of coastal loblolly pine to Arkansas and Oklahoma and talk about what was necessary to make that happen and why it was done. So this was done by Weyerhaeuser, a commercial tree growing company, and they own land in Arkansas and Oklahoma and were using local seed sources. But when they planted Atlantic coastal plain Provenance loblolly pine on the same site as local Provenance loblolly pine, there were huge differences in growth rate. So here's 25-year-old loblolly pine trees. Here's the local Provenance. Here's the Atlantic coastal plain Provenance. Huge difference in growth rate. And clearly, Weyerhaeuser is a tree growing company. They are interested in growing trees rapidly. So what they did was establish provenance tests. These are provenance trials where different provenances are planted together on sites where they think they might be planting them, and they grow them for some period of time, basically as long as they can. and compare growth rate, but also compare responses to those relatively infrequent extreme events. For instance, do every 5-year drought cause problems for the Atlantic coastal plain provenances versus the locals? And in the end, what Weyerhaeuser determined was that on some sites, this was a risk worth taking. Now, they couldn't plant those Atlantic coastal plain provenances on their most rocky, south-facing aspects, dry sites. In those situations, they were better off planting the local provenances. But in maybe a little bit wetter sites or less severe sites, they could get away with planting these Atlantic coastal plain provenances. So that was a situation where that risk was worth taking, and they mitigated that risk by doing test planting. So, test plantings or provenance trials are critical when you're going to take risks like this. What about seed transfer guidelines for assisted migration, sort of taking into account climate change? The current seed transfer guidelines for Lobbo Pine, remember, use those minimum winter temperature isotherms. But we know as climate is changing that minimum winter temperature in any particular location is not going to be the same. So, the question is, how does predicted change in temperature affect those Lobbo Pine seed transfer guidelines? So there was a project called Pine Map that looked at the potential effects of climate change on managed Lobbo Pine plantations. And one of the tools that they came out with was this tool that basically said, at the end of the century or at some point in the future, given what the climate models say the climate is going to be like in the future, how does that modify the seed transfer guidelines for Lobbo Pine? So, for instance, there's a tool that says, okay, at the end of century, if we have seed that has a provenance of Alachua County, Florida, where could that seed be planted at the end of century? And given end of century climate projections, basically they say that seed could be planted, in Athens, Georgia. So in 75 years from now, essentially what that's saying is the minimum winter temperatures in Athens, Georgia will probably be similar to what they are in Alachua County, Florida now. Now I always say a couple of things when I'm looking at models like this. One is that there's obviously some uncertainty associated with this. There are uncertainty associated with climate models. So I wouldn't necessarily bet the farm on this exact prediction. But what this does tell me is, one, the directionality of the change. What this is saying is that as we move into the future, it's likely that you're going to be able to move seed further north than you were in the past. The other thing that this tells me is it's just a reminder that things will not be the same in the future as they are now, and that we need to keep up with this kind of research if we're going to be doing adaptive management and moving genetics around on the landscape. The other thing that this tells me is that it makes me worry a little bit about seed transfer and assisted migration for non-commercial species. This is Lobbo Pine. We probably know more about the genetics and the climate tolerances for Lobbo Pine than we do for almost any other tree species in the world. But what about seed transfer guidelines for the hickories, or for the oaks, or for redbud? We know almost nothing about those, but they also likely will need to be moved around in the landscape. And so we're really going to need to be adaptive and smart about how we think about assisted migration. The Forest Service is doing a lot of great work on assisted migration right now, And I think the best advice I can give for forest managers in the future is just pay attention to that research and be prepared to adapt your management and your assisted migration thinking as that research progresses. Exotics and planting and management of exotics is another topic. Now, in North American forestry, we generally are usually managing native species within their native range, but in most of the rest of the world, most commercial forestry takes place with exotic species. And in a broader sense, certainly exotics are of interest for ecology. So exotics, are important in a lot of contexts. But just as a reminder, an exotic just means a species planted or regenerated outside its native range. I say planted because usually it's moved by humans, but not always. So an exotic is just a species planted or regenerated outside its native range. And like I said, forestry throughout the world uses exotics a lot. And why do they do that? Well, some of them relate to what we talked about with seed transfers, is that often exotics have advantages over native species. So, for instance, growth rate, often sometimes exotics are not affected by local tree diseases because the pathogen doesn't recognize that tree. Of course, the flip side is also true. Sometimes an exotic does not have any resistance to local diseases, so that coin has two sides. Another thing that's not obviously always apparent is sometimes it's just knowledge of species. If you're establishing a forest industry in a particular location, there may not be any existing knowledge about the local species, local native species. And there's a lot of things you have to know about a species in order to build a forest industry. You have to know how to establish nurseries, how do you germinate the seed, what do you do to manage it, what kind of spacing should you plant it in, what's the wood quality when you harvest it, how should you process the wood. Generally, you don't know anything about the native species if they haven't been used commercially, whereas some exotic species like the southern pines, we've been managing them for almost 100 years and we know a lot of that stuff. So sometimes you have a leg up by taking a species where there's lots of knowledge and planting it in a particular location. And you know how to establish nurseries, how to manage it, and so on. So that's another reason why it may be an advantage. Now, obviously, there's potential problems with planting or managing exotics. One is displacement of native ecosystem. Generally, when you're planting an exotic tree species, you're often displacing a native ecosystem, whether it's a native forest or a native grassland, for instance. Now, sometimes you may be afforesting. You may be, afforesting farmland or something like that hasn't been in forest or a native ecosystem for a long time. But at any rate, that displacement of native ecosystems is a big issue. There could be maladaptation of the exotic to local conditions or diseases. That certainly is a risk when planting exotics. I just wanted to make a note that usually when exotics are being managed in a particular location, those are usually land races. So a land race is just when an exotic has adapted to local conditions. So for instance, let's say someone is establishing Lobbo Pine in Argentina, and they bring seed from southeastern United States and plant that seed in test plantings in Argentina. Well, they select that seed and maybe even breed that seed and select it in the local environment, and then select genotypes that are best adapted to that local environment. If you do that for a few generations, that seed, hasn't come directly from the southern United States. It's done a few generations and has been selected for adaptation to that local environment. And that local adaptation, the seed that has that local adaptation, is called a landrace. So generally, managing exotics, they're managing landraces. So I want to give a few examples of management of exotics and their importance. Radiata pine is a really neat example. Radiata pine's native range is in Northern California, basically in 3 isolated populations along coastal Northern California. And it looks really scrubby. It actually is very similar to Torrey pine. I gave you an example of Torrey pine earlier. Radiata pine is another species that's probably making its last stand. These are basically its last populations. But Radiata pine is grown extensively as an exotic throughout the world. So these are herbarium samples from throughout the world, and this is sort of examples of where Radiata pine is grown commercially. In South America, in Europe, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, you find Radiata pine grown, and it grows really well. It grows actually much better than it does in those isolated locations in its native range. So it's a really interesting situation. Here's another example, Eucalyptus. Eucalyptus is a genus that's native to Australia, and there are 200 or 300 species of eucalyptus that grow in Australia. But a few of those species and their hybrids are grown throughout the world as exotics. So this is a 3-year-old eucalyptus. I'm not sure of the species or the hybrid, but this is a 3-year-old eucalyptus tree that's been harvested in Brazil. With my watch for scale, that's a pretty big tree for 3 years. It was probably 50 or 60 feet tall. So eucalyptus can grow very rapidly as an exotic. Here's another example. This is Lobbo Pine planted as an exotic in Brazil. Here's a person right here. This is probably a 5.5 foot tall person. And this is a stand of Lobbo Pine at age 14. It's being harvested. Here's a cross section of one of those trees here at age 14. Very rapidly growing. In fact, probably more volume production in these Lobbo Pine stands than in its native range. So sometimes exotics can grow more productively than they do in their native range. That's actually still a big ecological question, is why do exotics sometimes grow more rapidly outside their native range than in their native range? And there's some interesting hypotheses related to those that I'm not going to go into right now. This is just another example of Lobbo Pine growing in Brazil outside its native range. I wanted to show the carrying capacity here. The basal area here is very high. If trees in the United States were growing at this density, they'd be killing each other. They'd be dying and self-thinning. But in Brazil, they're able to maintain much higher basal areas than they are than Lobbo Pine is in its native range in the southeastern United States. So really interesting. So what are some general guidelines for seed transfer and for establishing exotics? So basically these are rules of thumb that are designed to prevent you or to reduce the risk of having maladaptation when you plant a seed outside its provenance or even outside its natural range. So some of those general rules of thumb are: don't move seed from Mediterranean climate to non-Mediterranean, or vice versa. And when I say Mediterranean climate, really what I mean is a climate with a very dry summer season and a wet, cool winter season, or vice versa. So basically the rule of thumb is don't transfer from a place with a dry summer to a place with a wet summer, or vice versa. So, and that sort of speaks also to don't transfer from a location with relatively uniform temperature or precip patterns to one without. Okay? You know, that makes sense looking at it, but really, you know, what these are trying to do is establish situations where you could really get in trouble. So basically you're looking for situations that are similar. So don't move from high elevation to low elevation, or high latitude to low latitude, or vice versa. Okay. Don't move seed drastically north or south, and don't move seed drastically up or down, because those are big climate differences. Now, we talked about rules of thumb before, about 100 degrees meter of elevation going up being roughly equivalent to going 1 degree latitude north. That can help. You know, you might transfer from a high elevation, low latitude further north to a lower elevation. You know, that might be some guidelines you can follow to help lower your risk. Another one is pay attention to soil. Acidic, basic, for instance. You know, most pines are adapted to acidic soils. You really can't transfer them to basic soils necessarily, and vice versa. You know, the final rule of thumb is there's no substitute for test plantings. Once you've paid attention to all of those rules of thumb, make test plantings in the locations where you anticipate reforesting, and grow them for as long as you can afford to keep an eye out for failures that maybe you didn't anticipate.